Thank you. So before I get too far into it, I want to draw attention to this link at the bottom, bit.ly/RTFM-JM. I'm going to mention a couple of blog posts, podcasts, articles, things like that, and links to all of those are available there. There's also a link to the joined in, so you can go give feedback. So I start all of my technical talks with this slide to give out my contact info. And I always tell people, if you have any questions about anything that we covered today or anything else that you think I could help you with, email me, send me a message. I'd love to help. And I do that because I truly love helping people. Knowing that I was able to solve a problem for someone, teach them something new, help them with their job, that's the whole reason that I come speak at conferences and do what I do. It's because I love helping people. But that wasn't always true for me. I've known that I wanted to be a programmer since I was in high school. I was really interested in math. I was getting an advanced degree in math, and they had a programming class as a math credit, so I took that. And I would come home every day from school talking to my dad about all the stuff I learned in programming class and how excited I was. And after a couple weeks, he kind of smiled at me and said, "You know this is what you're going to do, right?" He was a software engineer, and I think he could see that thing in me that needed to solve problems. After high school, I didn't really feel like college was right for me, so I moved to Arkansas to work on the Heifer International's educational ranch. And while I was there, I kept learning programming on my own. I learned how to make better websites. I started picking up better PHP, MySQL, things like MooTools and jQuery. And then a short time after that, I moved to Dallas and got my first job as a programmer. I wanted to learn as much as I could. I would jump on any chance to learn a new technology. The approach that I took to programming was I could solve any problem. I just had to figure out the right approach to do it. Now, I didn't actually know how to do it that well at that point, but I was able to fool people into thinking that I did. When people find out that I didn't go to college to become a programmer, oh, that's already full. They'll ask me, how did I learn it? I thought that picking up a lot of the basic stuff was easy, syntax, you should read the manual, right? Built-in functions and stuff like that, frameworks and libraries, it's all documented. So I learned a lot through trial and error, reading blogs, Googling things. There was a PHP forum that I joined, and I became a top contributor on there, asking my own questions and helping people with theirs, answering questions about how to debug their SQL statement, things like that. A lot of it was finding typos in people's code. I also used Stack Overflow a lot and became a top contributor on there. Raise your hand if you've used Stack Overflow or a forum or some resource like that. Yeah. Raise your hand again if you've ever asked a question and gotten RTFM. So I always explain that acronym to non-technical people as just read the manual. By the way, if you don't get this joke, read the forking manual. You need to start watching The Good Place. They just announced that they're ending with the 4th season, so you can go watch the whole thing. The 4th season's going to start soon. The premise of the show is that the main character, Eleanor, has died and gone to the good place. But that's an accident, because she's really a terrible human being. And she likes to curse a lot, but you can't curse in the good place. So she says forking a lot. Anyway, sometimes RTFM is all you get as an answer. Sometimes it's a link to the documentation, sometimes a little more helpful information. Sometimes it's really mean. People who respond this way to questions will often justify it by saying that the question asker needs to learn to ask better questions, and that they are really helping this person teaching them to do better research and to ask better questions. And there's a little bit of truth to that. If you know that you're not going to get help or that you might get made fun of, you're less likely to ask a question. Maybe you'll spend more time banging your head against the wall until you stumble across the answer, or maybe you'll give up and stop asking questions entirely. But sites like that actually have a ton of knowledge. So the best case scenario is that you search for your problem and it's already been answered, and you don't have to be the one to ask it. Sometimes you have to ask and you never get an answer. Sometimes you get answers and you learn something, and that's what happened a lot of the time for me. But along with all of that technical knowledge that I picked up, I learned things that did not make me a better programmer or a better person. I learned the condescending, judgmental, know-it-all attitude that people think of when they imagine a programmer. That attitude that tells people to RTFM or mocks people who call HTML a programming language. This is a screenshot of a Google search. It's in incognito, so it's not influenced by my browser history. And it says, "Why are programmers?" And the autocomplete is suggesting things like, "so rude," "socially awkward," "so arrogant," "such douchebags." I don't think this is a shock to any of us, right? We all laughed when this came up. We know that this is how people think of us. And it's even how we think of ourselves a lot of the time. In the tech community, we've accepted this for too long, that programmers are shitty human beings. A friend of mine suggested on Twitter that conferences should have a code of conduct, and someone responded this way: "You demand too much from nerds that lost a lot of social skills as a trade-off to be good." Think about that. This person is not saying that they don't want a code of conduct because they're worried about people abusing it. They're not worried about freedom of expression or something like that. They are saying that being good technologists is incompatible with treating other people with respect. We see this behavior in our tech leaders all the time. The biggest names in tech have reputations for being jerks. A prominent example is Linus Torvalds, who has been known for his rude behavior, profanity, and personal insults for years. There's an entire subreddit dedicated to Torvalds' rants and outbursts on the Linux kernel mailing list. A New Yorker article highlighted Torvalds' approach. The emails of the celebrated programmer Linus Torvalds land like thunderbolts from on high onto public lists, full of invective, insults, and demeaning language. "Please just kill yourself now. The world will be a better place," he wrote in one. Torvalds has defended his style for years, saying that it's just who he is. He despises being nice. He doesn't believe in politeness or political correctness. He's not empathetic. And he's even said that since his culture embraces cursing, telling him not to curse is being insensitive to him. Now, he's been successfully managing the Linux kernel development for over 20 years. He's argued that his no bullshit approach is working. Maybe it is. It's definitely kept people from wanting to contribute to that project. And it's reinforced and promoted this idea that technical communities are full of condescending jerks. It's not just Linus Torvalds. This behavior exists all over. I mentioned that PHP forum that I was a contributor on. One of my final posts on that forum from 2013 read this: Oh, and by the way, I don't come here to help ungrateful, whiny babies. So stop acting like a child, and remember this is a free help forum. After I solved their problem, I wrote, way to ensure you won't get my help again. This is why I don't usually write code for people. They act like assholes even when you give them what they want. Bite me. The first time I had to read that in front of a crowd, it was really hard. I resented customers who asked stupid questions. I picked on my coworkers who annoyed me for stupid reasons and criticized their code for equally stupid reasons. I would talk with the other programmers on my team about what idiots everyone else was. We worked at a team with a manual QA team overseas, and I remember seeing them as the enemy. Like, who did they think they were to find bugs in my code? I remember one coworker who wanted to introduce unit testing, and I refused to even listen to or consider his arguments. And anyone who was in Chris's talk earlier that saw me frantically waving my hand about unit testing, I love TDD. It's like the only way I write code. So in reality, at that time, I thought I was some hotshot genius. My technical skills were really what you would call expert beginner. I read a blog post titled, How Developers Stop Learning, Rise of the Expert Beginner by Eric Dietrich. In his post, he explains how he learned to bowl, not by putting his fingers in the ball, but just kind of chucking it down the lane. And he got pretty good at doing it that way until he stopped improving, and he was bowling 160 games. Eric writes, I asked my old manager what I could do to get back on track with improvement, and he said something very interesting to me. He said something like, there's nothing you can do to improve as long as you keep bowling like that. You've maxed out. If you want to get better, you're going to have to learn how to bowl properly. You need a different ball, a different style of throwing it, and you need to put your fingers in it like a big boy. And the worst part is that you're going to get way worse before you get better, and it will be a good bit of time before you get back to and surpass your current average. Eric goes on to explain the Dreyfus Model of skill acquisition and how when one can quickly learn skills in an isolated environment, they can get stuck in this offshoot phase called expert beginner. This phase stalls their development. For years, I worked like this, writing code because someone gave me a task in some project management software, and constantly being angry at everyone around me, and resenting everyone who asked me for anything or challenged me in any way. In April of 2014, my boss said we were going to a PHP conference. I didn't even know that that was a thing that existed. And at first, I was honestly not super excited about having to be around that many people. I've never been great with strangers. Like, my nightmare is when I'm in the self-checkout lane and the lady comes to talk to me, right? I don't want to interact with people I don't know, and there are times when I really don't want to interact with people that I know and like very much. So I went to the conference anyway, and I ended up having a really good time. It was an amazing experience where I got to listen to people explain technology and how I could use it. And it was okay that I didn't already know how to do it. Everyone was really encouraging. It was a lot of fun. This is a photo of me and Adam Culp, where I had just won the drawing for the PHP Zend elephant. I was 8 months pregnant at the time, so I was even grumpier, but it still was a good experience. We went back to Lone Star again the next year. And in between the sessions, I got to talk to Ben Ramsey. Ben has done and continues to do a lot of work for the PHP community. He's organized conferences and user groups. He wrote the array column userland implementation, and he writes and maintains the most popular PHP UUID library. So I got to talk to him, I think it was at lunch, and I said something like, It's so cool that you get to do this. I wish I could do something like this. And he said, you can. Everyone has something they can offer. It was totally okay with him that I didn't know so much information. And there were all these people who wanted to share information, and they did it in a way that didn't make me feel like an idiot, and they encouraged me to become a part of it. So at some point, I had to start thinking about what it meant when someone didn't know some piece of information that I did. The company I was working for at that time was so small that at one point it was the CTO and me was the IT department. And so we had to do all the networking and hardware stuff for all the employees in the office, including basic tech support. So one day, the office administrator asked me for help because she's been trying to write an email to a customer, and every time she types the customer's name, Chrome tries to bookmark her Gmail page, and she couldn't figure out what's going on. I could have looked down on her for not being able to figure that out, because I immediately knew what the problem was. I could have gotten this little hit of dopamine from judging her for not knowing as much as I did about computers. But instead, I walked over to her office, I grabbed a paperclip, and I stuck it under her control key and asked her to try again, and popped the key out of the keyboard, because it was just stuck down, and Control D was the shortcut for bookmarking a page, and the customer's name started with a D. Right? So she was so grateful. She had spent like half an hour trying to send an email, and I fixed it. I shrugged and walked back to my desk, and then something happened. There's this chemical in your brain that makes you feel good when you complete a task. It's the same chemical that makes us addicted to Candy Crush and World of Warcraft. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it floods your body when you solve a problem. It also floods your body when you do something nice for someone. So by fixing her computer for her in a nice way, I got to have that experience twice. I got to feel good from solving the problem, and I got to feel good for doing something nice for her. One evening in December of 2016, I got a text from a friend of mine that said, hey, can you make an Android app? And I was like, oh yeah, sure, I can do that, whatever. I didn't know how to, but fine. I thought he probably has like a business idea. He wants to make the next Flappy Bird or whatever. And I don't know, I didn't really want to do it. And then he spent the next hour texting me and telling me about how his friend's daughter, 18-year-old daughter, had just woken up from a coma. She had had an arteriovenous malformation, which is a tangle of abnormal blood vessels connecting the arteries and veins in your brain. And 2 hours after that happened, she had life-saving surgery that removed a portion of her brain the size of a kiwi fruit. And she was in a coma for 31 days. When she woke up from the coma, she could only move her eyes, so she could blink. She couldn't really move anything else. So they were communicating entirely through blink once for yes and blink twice for no, because they weren't eligible to get the fancy eye-tracking hardware and software that would have made it possible for them to communicate. She had no way to tell them, I'm thirsty, or my head hurts, or I want to watch TV. And they had no way of knowing if she was even still capable of thinking those things. So my friend asked me if I could help make an app so that she could communicate in some way. So they asked for something that would just show the letters in the alphabet so they could click on them when she blinked, and then she could spell out words. I told him that I didn't think I could actually make an Android app that quickly, but I could make him a website. And would that work? He said yes, so we sat down, and I spent 45 minutes making this Vue.js website that just let you cycle through letters and click on them. I threw the generated site onto an Amazon S3, sent him the URL, and they used it. I thought they only used it for a couple of weeks, and then I went and looked at the website history at Amazon, and they used it for several months. After a couple months, Livia had recovered enough to where she could walk. She started writing a couple months ago. So she still has a ton of recovery ahead of her, but she's been making really good progress. So here I was, spending 45 minutes to create something in a language I didn't know. I wrote JavaScript code that my front-end developer friends would probably make fun of for someone that I didn't know, without knowing if it would even actually help, because it might. So why couldn't I spend 5 extra minutes to do code review and leave thoughtful comments for my coworkers? Why was I so angry at people who had done nothing but ask for my help or exist in the world around me? Why did I resent the people who used the products that I built and get annoyed that they didn't understand how technology works? There's something that made it so obvious to me that Livia deserved my help, but it wasn't so obvious to me at the time that everyone deserved it. I realized I was stuck on the expert beginner stage of being a human being. Just like Eric had to relearn how to bowl properly, I needed to relearn how to treat people around me. I needed a different style of throwing the ball. I wasn't trying to be an asshole. I wasn't waking up every day and deciding to fuck with everyone, like this person suggests. The problem was that I wasn't making any kind of conscious effort to be respectful. I wasn't making any choice to be kind every day, and I was letting my anger dictate every action that I took and every interaction that I had. I'm not saying that I transformed into a nice, helpful, happy person overnight. I will be the first to admit that I still did a lot of shitty stuff. I've made a lot of mistakes in my adult life, and I've treated people around me poorly. Whenever people confronted me about that behavior, I always had an excuse. It was everyone else's fault, or I don't care what people think of me, or I didn't do it on purpose, so it's not really my fault. I wish I'd known why I was doing it. I wish that I knew why I had been so angry all the time. A lot of people will say that they don't mean to be a jerk. So even if they can admit that they are, they justify it, thinking that it's okay for them to keep hurting people because they're not doing it on purpose. If you're not making a conscious decision to hurt people, it's not your fault. The Upgrade by The Life Hacker did an episode called How to Not Be a Dick, in which they interviewed a former childhood bully named Jeffrey. In the interview, Jeffrey mentions several times about how angry he was as a teenager. He describes being as young as 5 years old, playing baseball, and he could pitch a perfect game, but the team still lost by 1 point, and he would lock himself in his room and cry because he felt this intense pressure to be perfect. In the interview, he says, "I didn't come home every day and think, wow, I'm a bully. I came home and thought, I'm a tough guy, I'm a great guy, and don't pick a fight with me." The victim of Jeffrey's bullying, Eric, chimes in to describe how he felt like Jeffrey was a giant because of how aggressive he was. But really, Eric was a foot taller. As the interview goes on, Jeffrey explains how, at some point, he had to ask himself, why am I so angry? We get angry at people who ask bad questions because we think they're wasting our time. We get angry at other people that we think they're not working as hard as we think they should be. We get angry at people who challenge the way we do things. We get angry at people who we think are some kind of threat. Anger is actually a secondary emotion most of the time, meaning that it stems from another emotion entirely. And behind all of this anger is fear. We naturally try to fight the things that we are most insecure about. Sometimes pointing out that we know the answer makes us feel better about our unacknowledged fear that we don't know other answers. In the interview, Jeffrey describes his fear of not being good enough, even when he succeeded. If it wasn't good enough, if it wasn't perfect, he still felt fear and guilt. Sometimes when we tell other people it's easy, just read the manual, what we're really saying is, I need to convince myself it's easy. All you have to do is read the manual. Because I'm scared to admit that sometimes there aren't easy answers. Sometimes we are unintentionally pointing out how much smarter we are than the question asker by using words like simple, easy, just. I think that we can alleviate a lot of this fear and anger by substituting it with empathy. I have to admit, I wasn't raised in an environment where empathy was something that was encouraged. I don't think I ever really heard people talk about it until a couple years ago when I saw a talk by Samantha Quinones where she talked about empathy. So it would be easy for me to say that since I wasn't raised with this as a value, that it's not my fault, that I don't know how to do it, and I could have kept using that as an excuse to defend my behavior. But after seeing other people, successful people, practicing empathy in their everyday lives, I had to admit that I had a problem, and that it was possible to be both a good programmer and to be kinder and respectful and compassionate. And I've never been satisfied seeing a problem go unsolved. The same thing happened for Linus Torvalds. I spoke earlier about how he's been an example of some of the negative stereotypes of programmers. Last year, Torvalds made a surprising announcement when, after he accidentally scheduled some conflicts, basically so that he could try and avoid the yearly Linux kernel summit meeting, he was confronted by the Linux community about his behavior. Torvalds wrote, "This week, people in our community confronted me about my lifetime of not understanding emotions. My flippant attacks and emails have been both unprofessional and uncalled for, especially at times when I made it personal. In my quest for a better patch, this made sense to me. I now know this was not okay, and I am truly sorry." The above is basically a long-winded way to get to the somewhat painful personal admission that I need to change some of my behavior, and I want to apologize to the people that my personal behavior hurt and possibly drove away from kernel development entirely. I'm going to take some time off and get some assistance on how to understand people's emotions and respond appropriately. There's a comedy podcast that I listen to called My Brother, and Me, hosted by Justin Travis and Griffin McElroy. And they taught me a lot about respecting people. When they first started their show, they did it just as a way for them to keep in touch with each other, and they were goofing around. And they made a lot of jokes at first that didn't age well. They made one joke in particular about furries, and they were really mean in an attempt to be funny. And then they got some letters from some of their listeners, and those listeners said, "Hey, I'm a furry, and I like you guys, but what you said really hurt my feelings." So they had two choices at that point. They could either pull that defensive thing where they go, "Hey, it's just a joke, lighten up," or they could admit that they were wrong, apologize, and change their behavior. And they chose the second one. They apologized, and they started making an effort to be more empathetic. They grew as comedians, and they created and nurtured this amazing, welcoming, inclusive community based around encouragement and comedy that isn't cruel. They went on to grow their podcast into a TV show, several spin-off podcasts. They do national tours, and they recently had the graphic novel adaptation of one of their shows be #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The second one of it is coming out, and I have tickets to go see them and get it. I'm so excited. So Justin McElroy wrote a blog post entitled, "What It Has Taken Me 33 Years to Learn." And the first item on the list is you can be funny and kind or funny and cruel. The second one is easier, but the first one is worth it. I had to learn that I can be a programmer and be cruel to the people around me, or I can be a programmer and be respectful, kind, helpful, and encouraging. It's actually not easier to be mean. Like, maybe it is in comedy, but not in our regular lives. It might seem like it is at first, but I was hurting myself and the people around me. It's easier to be kind, even if it means that when a customer emails me because their plugin isn't working, that instead of just sending them a link to the documentation, because I can clearly see where they went wrong, I spend a few extra minutes finding the settings that they have enabled, writing a running code snippet that they can use, and emailing it to them along with the documentation. Last year at Southeast PHP, I asked Sarah Goldman if she could help me and a friend of mine. Stephen Wade came up with an idea for a RFC to PHP, and he asked if I could help. And neither of us knew any C, so we're like, we don't even know where to get started on this. Help us, Sarah, please. And she went over the idea with us and determined if it was feasible, and said it was. And then she sat down with us for about 40 minutes to show us where all the code was that we would have to touch, and explaining, things that we might run into. And then she actually wrote the implementation and sent it to us. She had planned on using that time to get ready for her own talk, but instead, she sat with us and wrote the code and carefully explained everything. The post that I mentioned from that PHP forum, that it was my last post there, I solved their problem, right? I got their code working. I fixed their bug. What do you think they walked away from that experience thinking about me and about that community? I compare that to the exchange I had with Sarah, or the recent email that I sent to my customer. I helped them without ever needing to imply that they were an idiot, which would be absolutely unacceptable in a professional environment, but it still happens. There's a reason that programmers don't often talk to customers. So there, when I had a chance, I practiced empathy. I understood how much time and effort that person had put into debugging their site, and how frustrating it was, and how helpless they felt when they finally had to ask us to fix it. I respected that person and their time and their value. I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I still make mistakes. We don't have to be perfect, but we do have to get rid of this idea that programmers are hostile jerks. We have to start treating each other and the people around us with more respect and empathy. Most of the time when we're talking about empathy, what we're talking about is known as emotional or affective empathy. This is what Linus was describing, which is being able to respond to someone else's emotions with an appropriate emotion. There's another aspect to empathy known as cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand another person's perspective. I think that a lot of the conflict that we deal with could be reduced a little if we practiced our cognitive empathy. So often, we don't take the time to put ourselves in another person's shoes. It's easier to dismiss them if we can't empathize with their experiences. And it can be really hard to understand just how different someone else's life experiences have been from ours. So it's hard, so we don't do it, and we dismiss them. We're going to try a little experiment. I want everybody to close your eyes and imagine yourself on a beach. Imagine the blue-green waves crashing against the shore. Imagine your toes digging into the white sand. Think about the sounds of seagulls flying overhead. Think about the smell of the salt water. Maybe there's beautiful palm trees on your beach, or maybe there's a fire pit in the sand where people are making s'mores. Okay, you can open your eyes. I want you to raise your hand if you would use the words pictured, saw, or visualized to describe what you just did. Raise your hand if in your mind you saw yourself on a beach or saw a beach. It's a lot of hands. Some of you might even say that you smelled the salt water or the fire pit, or you heard the sound of the waves. This is what I see. There is no such thing as visualization for me. There is no mind's eye. It's this. When I imagine things, I don't see them or hear them or smell them. I imagine them in my own way. I can think about the facts that I know about them, like I know what color the ocean is, and I know how salt water smells. And I remember walking in the sand with my friends or making s'mores on the beach with my daughter. I just do it differently. And I will never know what it's like to be able to see that picture in my head. I know what she looks like, but I can't see it, no matter how hard I try. And this is called aphantasia. It's the inability to produce visual images in my mind. I don't have any other senses in my mind. I don't smell or taste things. Conversations in my head are only in my voice. So there's a part of your brain that lights up on an MRI when you see an image with your eyeballs. And the same part lights up when you visualize or picture an image in your mind, unless you have aphantasia and can't actually visualize things. I didn't find this out until last year when a coworker shared an article about aphantasia. I had to start asking my friends if they could really see things in their mind, because I'd gone my whole life so far thinking that everyone was being super metaphorical when they talked about visualization. I didn't understand that the vast majority of people, when they say picture things, they mean they picture things. And that I didn't understand that until I read about the 2% of people who don't. So when I figured it out, it actually made a lot of sense for me. It explained why I thought it was silly and boring when fiction writers described how their characters looked and used flowery language to describe a scene. My husband finally understood why I didn't know if I liked the new paint color for my office or the bedroom until it was on the walls. I started explaining it to my friends, and so many people had a hard time understanding. One of my friends asked, like, "You mean it's all just black and white?" It's like, no, there's no pictures. I always hated when people did that thing where they tell you to close your eyes and picture something, because it's super boring for me. A friend of mine even asked me how I cook, because when she's cooking, she knows what it's going to taste like already, and she doesn't ever taste her food while she cooks. And I'm like, I don't know, I just taste it, and then I fix it. So I only found this out, by the way, because someone else was sharing their experience. I clicked on this article because I wanted to read what it was like for a friend of mine. To so many people, the experience of not being able to visualize things is unimaginable. And in a crowd this size, I may have just clued 1 or 2 people into the fact that they also have this. But for most people, they cannot put themselves in my shoes any more than I can close my eyes and picture myself on that beach. So I'm talking about something that honestly has very little impact, right? I went 32 years of my life without knowing that my brain worked a little bit differently from most people's in this one area. So clearly, it wasn't keeping me from doing anything important. It didn't matter that much. How do we handle it when it's something that really does matter? This is a quote from a former coworker of mine, Q. Someone shared an article about infighting between CSS devs and JavaScript devs and CSS devs. Q says, undervaluing, underestimating front-end code is very much a thing, especially if you do CSS things like I do. I feel this sometimes. According to some, stuff I do isn't considered real programming. I don't know why there exists a need to look down on others or for folks to have to defend their profession or work. Q is amazing at CSS. I can't do what he does. What benefit is there to devaluing his work? Would insisting that what he does isn't programming actually make me a better programmer? Or would it just make me feel better about the fact that as a back-end dev, CSS is utterly confusing and overwhelming to me? This is a tweet from Lindsay Scott with a screenshot from an Instagram post featuring her. Lindsay is a Victoria's Secret model. She has a bachelor's degree in computer science, and she knows multiple programming languages. Some of the comments on the Instagram post include, well, printing hello world these days is considered coding, and what a waste. Her tweet says, looking forward to the day when women in tech don't have to go above and beyond to prove themselves. Lindsay has already gone above and beyond and is still not being respected. These comments aren't just dismissive or thoughtless, they're flat out mean, they're abusive. Why are the people making these comments spending the energy to send a hateful message to someone who has done nothing to them but simply exist? I think it's because they're afraid. They feel like they constantly have to prove their own worth. They're scared. If Lindsay can do everything they can and more, will they lose their value? They're angry. Maybe they've worked incredibly hard to get where they are, and they aren't being recognized. They don't feel valued. We're going to go back to Eleanor from The Good Place. This is a season 3 episode. Don't worry, there's no major spoilers. You can still go watch the show. So Eleanor is lashing out at everyone. She destroys this cake. She's screaming at them. She says, I'm going to take me out of this cake and go. And then she yells at them and leaves. Her friend Simone, a neuroscientist, finds her later hiding behind a tree with her cake. Eleanor asks Simone, why did I do that? Simone explains that as humans evolved and learned to live together, we first had to overcome the problem of me versus us, an individual learning to sacrifice a little bit of individual freedom for the good of the group, so we don't get eaten by tigers. The next problem humans had to overcome was us versus them, trying to see other groups of people who are different as equals. And this one we're still struggling with. Simone guesses that Eleanor never moved past the me versus us stage. And now that the first group she's been a part of is coming to an end, she's scared of being alone again. This fear manifests itself as anger, and Eleanor is trying to protect herself, to convince herself that she doesn't need these people, that she doesn't even like them. Justin's post of advice also includes a lot of other good items, such as, I can count on one hand the number of times putting out negativity has brought me back something worthwhile. And even when it works, it feels terrible. Empathy is the final step of maturity. It can take some work, but you'll be shocked how much easier the world is to navigate when you remember to use it. He also reminds us that we are probably not drinking enough water. It's okay if you don't like talking to people. I still don't. I'm always happy to talk to anyone at a conference, and I will always answer an email asking for help. But I still have anxiety, and I still hate it when that cashier comes to talk to me at the self-checkout, because it's the self-checkout, and I have both of my earbuds in, and why are you trying to talk to me? I don't know, maybe her boss makes her do that. Maybe all of her kids grew up and moved away, and she's lonely all the time because she doesn't have anyone to talk to. It doesn't matter, because it doesn't solve anything for me to be angry at her about it. And solving problems is my favorite thing to do. That's why I got into programming, to solve problems for people. And I forgot about that for a while. I forgot that the paycheck only keeps coming because the code I'm writing is ultimately solving a problem for other people. That problem might be technologically challenging. You could be using the newest languages to write things that we can't even dream of yet. You could be doing something really mundane, like automating a reporting process that previously took someone 4 hours to do every month. Or you could be doing something as life-changing and inspiring as allowing a teenager to tell her family that she's okay after she had brain surgery. If I had continued to view the people around me as beneath me instead of as equals, I might never have had the chance to help Livia. But now I have the opportunity to help anyone who asks for it. Going forward, I'm making a choice to be kind every day. I'm making a conscious effort to be thoughtful and purposeful about the way that I speak to and about people around me. I'm choosing to wake up every day and say, I'm not going to be a dick today. I'm not going to be perfect, but I can be a lot better. The lack of empathy, understanding, respect, and compassion in tech is a problem, and we are all responsible for solving it. With the software that we write, the tickets we respond to, the jokes we make, the actions we take every day, we make changes in the world. We are responsible for making things better. So let's do it. Thank you.